Hi, this is Pastor Ryan Chang, and thank you for visiting my YouTube channel. A few days after the disturbing report on Ravi Zacharias came out, someone who just entered my house, a believer, upon seeing one of Zacharias' books on the coffee table said, "You have to get rid of that book." Yeah, this one feels different. Probably because Zacharias doesn't fit the stereotype of many of the fallen spiritual leaders. He was intelligent, pensive, and above all, appeared very godly. So I have to say, those who were influenced by his ministry feel profoundly disappointed with Zacharias, even feeling betrayed. In light of that, I want to share a message prepared not too long ago that points out what this sort of failure by spiritual leaders reveals about sin, our faith, and how God's work is really done. The first installment of the message is given under the title of Sin and Spiritual Leaders. The second segment is entitled What Our Response to the Failure of Spiritual Leaders Says About Our Faith. And the final installment of this short series asks the question of, was any spiritual good done by the fallen spiritual leaders? Thank you, and may the Lord have mercy on all of us. I began this message with a kind of strange illustration. So if punch the guy with your best right hook, but he doesn't even flinch, it's about time that you either surrender or you run away. You know, around the time Noah, the humanity had become corrupt in God's sight and full of violence, Genesis 6:11. And Genesis 6:12 says that, quote, all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways, end of quote. And it was just horrendous place the earth had become. So God allowed the universal flood to pass, and it wiped out the entire humanity except 8 people. Noah, you know the story very well. He was chosen to continue the human race on account that he was righteous, Genesis 6:9. Once the water had receded, the land seemed ready for a fresh start. All the sinners had been removed. The sin was, as a matter of speaking, KO'd. It was time for a new beginning, a better thing to come. But the water was too weak to wipe away the sin, for sin came right back with vengeance. It began with Noah himself, a righteous man, yet he got drunk and then he undressed himself before his younger son, Ham. Ham showed contempt for his father's behavior. And then Noah, once he sobered up the next day, instead of being remorseful for what he did, he cursed Ham's son, Canaan. Canaan didn't do anything. That's his grandson, but he cursed him forever. That's what happened after the flood got rid of all the sinners. The sin came right back, as if it was never punched, that it was never kicked. So going back to my open illustration, sin got punched in the face with a mighty universal flood, but it barely flinched. And if that's all we got, flood or external measures like programs, activities to deal with sin, we are in trouble. No wonder some people, recognizing this, have capitulated to sin, becoming willing and miserable slave of sin. Some other people have actually run away to mountains, caves, and deserts. We call them monks or hermits. But to their disappointment, they found out that they brought sin with them. They found the enemy, and the enemy is right in the midst of them, in fact, inside of them. Paul said that sin still lives in us. Going back to Genesis, within 2 chapters after Noah's line began to repopulate the earth, the entire humanity was united in the effort to challenge God. Recall the Tower of Babel? They wanted to reach heavens without any God's help, to tell them, hey, we got here, God, we don't need you. And for that, God had judged them, and that's when the language was divided into multiple languages so that man could not unite and to challenge God as a collective unit. Yeah, sin is potent. Sin is powerful. Sin should never be taken lightly. Hamartia, missed the mark in Greek. We missed the mark in a grandiose fashion, in a horrific fashion. Churches have gotten so enamored with their own programs and their brands, their activities, that they are led to think that they have licked sin problem. Actually, we have grossly underestimated the power of sin, as if sin can be diminished by our programs, our wonderful programs. Sin is not to be taken lightly. And spiritual leaders have been no great exception when it comes to falling and failing. In the Bible, you don't have to go too far to find spiritual leaders who experience some serious breakdown, moral or otherwise. Let me mention names that you recognize. King David, a man after God's own heart, and yet he committed adultery, murder of the husband of the woman he began to sleep with, and then the spiritual pretension, like acting holy while his lover, Bathsheba, was pregnant with their love child. He acted as if, that baby was actually the child of the man he had killed, Bathsheba's husband. Then that charade was all broken up by Prophet Nathan. You're the man who committed that sin. That's David. And then we know about Moses, right? Now he murdered, but you can kind of excuse him because he wasn't a believer at that time. But when he did become a leader of Israel, he spectacularly disobeyed God in the full view of the Israelites. Psalm 106:33 says, rash words came from Moses' lips, and it was actually very consequential. Actually, people were complaining all the time. They were roaming the desert 40 years, no food, thirsty, no water. You guys, you brought me out here to kill us, So Moses had up to here, right? So when they complained for water, this is Numbers chapter 20, verse 8. God told Moses, quote, speak to the rock before their eyes. But Moses, in anger at people, Numbers 20:11, quote, raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. He was angry. So instead of speaking to the rock, as God told him to do, he struck the rock twice in anger. And God wasn't happy with that. So God said to Moses, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. In other words, Moses was the deliverer. He led these people for 40 years, and yet because of one single mistake, he did not make it to the promised land. Wow. That's a serious failure. And Moses paid a dear price. By the way, water did come out. Now that's a significant note. I'll come back to that a little later. Now, mentioning of these failures, these illustrious spiritual leaders, isn't to minimize what they did, but to underscore some things that the modern church have forgotten. Yes, I'm going back to hamartia. Sin is real. Nathan Shattuck, he's a founder and spiritual director of Soul Care Christian Counseling. And he had this to say, and I transcribed it. Now, by the way, he has counseled hundreds of pastors, if not more. He said this, quote, we ought not to be surprised when something like this happened. Failure of spiritual leaders. We've seen the example of Moses, David. As a leaders, they failed spectacularly, and they paid a dear price. So we are not to be surprised when something like this happened with a Christian leader. Not out of cynicism or resignation. We ought to be saddened and frustrated and deal with it seriously, but there is significant sin in every Christian and every Christian leader's heart if you know them well enough. That's really shocking to hear. the reason why you don't think there's any issue is because you're not near enough. But when you know them well enough, according to this man who has had hundreds of pastors in his counseling room talking about their life, where they went wrong, that you find out that there's a significant amount of sin in not only Christians, but even Christian leaders. Sin is not to be taken lightly. Now, when leaders fall, it in effect brings up three important matters that we usually don't address with any kind of force. That's what I'm going to do today. Three matters that rise up when we see our spiritual leaders have failed. And in the next section, we'll address the first of these matters under the rubric of this statement. Situations in which spiritual leaders have fallen reveal in whom we have placed our trust.